Hey guys, tonight we wade gently into the still green waters of a lake that no longer exists, Lake Texcoco, the marshy, shallow heart of a vanished empire. There's a soft mist clinging to the surface, dragonflies hovering lazily, and reeds rustling like secrets just out of reach. You are barefoot, as usual in these stories, your feet sinking slightly into cool muck. The air smells like damp earth and crushed lilies. You're here because the Aztecs saw what you're seeing now, swampy chaos, and decided to build dinner on top of it. You probably won't survive this, not because of jaguars or obsidian blades, though those are floating around the background, but because this place is damp in every possible direction. Your boots squelch, your knees itch, your last dry piece of clothing gave up around noon, and yet the Aztecs, they flourish, not despite this marsh, but because of it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just been conscripted as a novice farmer by one of the Chinampa clans, a community of agricultural geniuses with very muddy fingernails and suspiciously patient smiles. You're given a wooden hoe, a canoe that leaks a little, and a vague instruction to meet at the willow pole. This is your new life, knee-deep in water, completely unsure what a willow pole is, and too embarrassed to ask. It's the 14th century, and the Mexica people, who will later be called the Aztecs, have recently migrated into the Valley of Mexico, nudging their way past older city-states, making temporary alliances and eventually choosing the absolute wettest patch of land for their great capital, Tenochtitlan. Why? Because according to legend, this is where they saw the omen they'd been waiting for, a cactus growing on a rock, with an eagle devouring a snake atop it. You know, just your average Tuesday vision. Tenochtitlan rises from the lake like a floating jewel. Canals crisscross the island city, temples gleam in the sun, and behind it all, the people quietly feed this marvel, using an invention both humble and profound, the Chinampa. The Chinampa isn't just a floating raft of dirt, it's a carefully constructed rectangle of labor, patience, and mud-related optimism. Farmers pick the shallow edges of the lake and begin staking out plots using long reeds. The word Chinampa likely comes from Nahuatl roots, meaning something like square made of reeds, though historians still argue whether the term originally referred to the technique or just the structure. Your hands are starting to prune from the water, but you notice the logic of it. Each floating bed is built layer by layer, almost like a lasagna. If lasagna were made of swamp muck, lake sediment, and cut-up water hyacinths. The Aztecs understood the rhythm of their watery world. Too dry, and the crops would shrivel. Too wet, and the roots would rot. So they found the in-between, the floating middle ground. And of course, you are assigned to the most senior farmer on the lake, a woman named Xochitl, who is old enough to remember when Tenochtitlan was just a soggy campfire ring. She rose without speaking, her paddle slicing cleanly through the water as she points out things you didn't even know had names. This is amaranth, that's where ducks nest. This is where you never, ever relieve yourself, unless you enjoy being cursed. Under her guidance, you begin to understand the elegance of the system. Each Chinampa is surrounded by narrow canals just wide enough for a canoe. These form a grid, a kind of wet checkerboard, that you could almost mistake for farmland if you squinted, but the edges blur. One wrong step, and you're suddenly ankle-deep in silt again, clutching a head of lettuce like a drowning man clutches a log. And it's not just farming, it's ritual. Before planting the first seedlings, Xochitl gently places a flower on the bed and whispers something to the lake. You ask if it's a prayer. She tells you, with a slow smile, that it's a reminder to the mud that it has a job to do. The water around you reflects the sky like a mirror, but distorted, shimmering. Birds cry out, herons, egrets, ducks with too many opinions. Every now and then, you spot a fish flitting just below the surface, or the ripple of something larger. Xochitl says not to worry about the crocodiles unless they look at you like they know your name. You're startled by how peaceful it all feels. In the soft silence, the slow rocking of the canoe, and the hum of insects that don't seem particularly interested in biting you, the city feels far away. But you're still feeding it every bean, every chili pepper, every tomatillo floating down these sleepy green lanes. Historians still debate whether the Chinampa system was developed solely by the Aztecs or inherited from earlier civilizations like the Xochimilca, who had already been working these lakes for generations. What's certain is that the Mexica perfected the technique, scaling it into a system that could feed hundreds of thousands, possibly even 1 million, without horses, wheels, or iron tools. You make it to the willow pole by sunset. Turns out it's a landmark, a tall, skinny tree planted at the end of one of the beds to help young farmers find their way. You tie up your canoe, stretch your sore legs, and receive a tamale wrapped in a corn husk from someone who smells like mint and soil. The stars are starting to come out. The water laps gently against the mud walls of the Chinampa. You're not just surviving this, you're kind of thriving, which is surprising given the footwear situation. The sun rises slowly over Lake Texcoco, gilding the reeds in pale gold. You're already awake, half slouched in the canoe you didn't realize doubled as a bed. There's a chill in the air, the kind that settles into your joints and whispers that maybe you should have chosen the priesthood. But Xochitl is already knee-deep in mud, humming to herself as she slaps another armful of lake muck onto a floating bed of reeds. Welcome to Raft Building Day. Raft might be a generous term. What you're really building is a squishy rectangle of persistence and hope. The first step is bundling up long stalks of tule reed, which you lash together with cords made of twisted fibre. Then you paddle out to a shallow stretch of lakebed, often near the shore where the water is more forgiving, and begin the methodical act of layering mud and vegetation until you have something dense enough to hold weight, but flexible enough to survive the push and pull of water and wind. Xochitl has you gather lake sediment, which you do with a long-handled scoop that you're convinced was invented by someone with overly long arms. The mud is warm, black, and teeming with life, worms, bugs, the occasional unhappy frog. And it smells like yesterday's rain mixed with compost and a distant hint of fish. Layer after layer, the Chinampa grows. First the reeds, then the mud, then a blanket of decaying aquatic plants like water lilies or algae mats, then more mud, then another tangle of reeds, over and over, like you're making a swamp lasagna no one should ever eat. Historians still argue whether these rafts originally floated freely or were always anchored to the lakebed or nearby islets. Some accounts describe fully buoyant Chinampas that were later fixed in place. Others suggest they were more like raised beds from the beginning. What's certain is that they eventually stabilized, their perimeters staked down with long poles of ahuejote willow, which not only marked the corners but sprouted into full trees, holding the structure firm with their roots. You help pound in one such pole with a stone mallet. It takes forever. Your arms feel like overcooked maize by the end of it, and the pole still lists slightly to the left. But Xochitl just nods. Crooked things feed people too, she says. Lunch is a roasted squash and some tlacoyos, a kind of thick tortilla stuffed with beans. You eat it with your muddy hands, sitting on the damp edge of the Chinampa, watching fish dart through the canal below your feet. Nearby, a heron stands motionless, pretending not to be judging you. The days pass like this: build, paddle, plant, repeat. You learn to recognize which mud has the best consistency, the darker, the better, and how to keep your bundles of reeds tight enough to hold shape, but loose enough to allow water flow. You also learn to ignore the occasional unexpected splash, which Xochitl insists is just a curious turtle every time, even when you're pretty sure it's the same log-shaped creature that blinked at you yesterday. And then the best part, the planting. Once the raft has sat for a few days, settled into its watery home, Warmed by the sun, it's ready to become a garden. Farmers start by planting the three sisters: maize, beans and squash. Corn grows tall, beans climb its stalks, and squash spreads across the base, shading the soil and keeping it moist. It's not just efficient, it's poetic and practical, and suspiciously effective, considering it was figured out without so much as a single PowerPoint presentation. At night, the Chinampas glow faintly in the moonlight, and the canals shimmer like veins. You lie back in the canoe and listen to the sounds: frogs croaking, the splash of something large and uninterested, a distant drumbeat from the city, and Xochitl quietly sharpening her planting stick for tomorrow. Sometimes she tells stories. One is about a hummingbird god who taught the first gardener how to speak to mud. Another is about a Chinampa that once drifted too far and was mistaken for an island by a very confused duck. You laugh more than you should, probably due to exhaustion and too much squash. Somewhere in the distance, Tenochtitlan hums, but here it's just you, the mud, and the slow satisfaction of watching something grow. A week ago, you were a shivering mess with wet feet and no clue what a Chinampa even was. Now, you're still damp, still confused, but you're building floating farms. One muddy handful at a time. By now you know the rhythm of the lake. You know that the egrets always land on the same crooked willow at dawn, that the wind shifts slightly just before sunset, carrying the scent of roasted chilies and damp stone from the direction of the city. And you definitely know that the dark splash under the canoe is not a curious turtle, no matter what Xochitl says with that suspicious smile. But today you're learning something new. How to anchor a Chinampa so it doesn't float off during a storm, or worse, drift into someone else's maize rows, triggering an awkward and highly muddy boundary dispute. The willow poles, or ahuejotes, are key. These aren't just stakes, they're living anchors. You paddle out with a bundle of green saplings, each taller than you and surprisingly heavy. They've been trimmed and prepped, their bark shaved just enough to encourage rooting. Your job? Jam them deep into the soft lake bed at each corner of your Chinampa until they stand tall and stubborn, like sleepy soldiers. Easier said than done. The first sapling you plant falls over like a drunk flamingo. The second sort of wobbles in place, looking very apologetic. But the third, that one, sinks in with a satisfying squelch and stands up straight like it's been waiting for this its whole life. You name it, victory stick. Xochitl rolls her eyes but doesn't object. These trees will grow quickly, their roots weaving through the mud and reeds, knitting the Chinampa together from below. In time, they'll offer shade for delicate crops, nesting spots for birds, and, crucially, natural fencing to mark your territory. You can even harvest willow branches for firewood without killing the tree. It's sustainable, elegant, and just a bit magical. There's a subtle art to placement. Too close to the edge, and your Chinampa begins to buckle. Too far, and it sags in the middle like an old mattress. Xochitl explains this by drawing in the mud with a stick, pausing occasionally to flick beetles off your foot. You nod as if you understand. You mostly don't. Anchoring complete, you take a break and drift through the canals. It's your reward for surviving the willow wrestling. The Chinampa zone is eerily calm, like a maze made of gardens and water mirrors. You pass rows of flowering beans, tall stalks of maize, rustling like gossiping grandmothers, and squash vines that seem to reach toward your canoe with lazy curiosity. Then you spot it. Off in the distance, near the edge of the cultivated zone, a massive log-like shape slips beneath the surface. Yep, definitely not a turtle. The old-timers talk about the lake's original inhabitants, crocodiles large and lazy, with no real interest in humans unless provoked. Xochitl insists they're mostly vegetarian. You decide not to test the mostly part. She tells you that in the early days, when the Mexica were still newcomers to the valley, crocodiles were seen as guardians of the lake, moodier cousins of the rain gods. There are even rumors of a Chinampa that was built on a sleeping croc, which no one noticed until it yawned and casually relocated the entire lettuce crop. Historians still debate whether these stories are metaphors or just enthusiastic overstatements, but the image of a lettuce-laden lizard gently ferrying salad across the lake is now permanently in your brain. You ask what happens if a crocodile really does visit your Chinampa. Xochitl shrugs. Don't plant chili near the edge. They don't like spicy. Good to know. As you drift, you also notice how busy the lake is, not just with animals, but with people. Canoes glide silently past, piloted by boys no older than 10, delivering tools, gossip, and the occasional overly ambitious pumpkin. Farmers greet each other with low whistles, each clan using slightly different notes to identify themselves. It's like a bird call system for people who are ankle-deep in mud all day. One canoe passes with an entire altar on board, flowers, incense, and what looks like a very cooperative chicken. You raise an eyebrow. Xochitl just murmurs, "Lake gods like gifts," as if that clears everything up. Back on your Chinampa, you help with a round of planting sweet potatoes and amaranth. You're getting better, your rows are almost straight, and your planting stick no longer doubles as an accidental foot poker. Xochitl offers what you think might be praise. At least the beans are in the dirt this time. You spend the evening watching the willows. The newly planted saplings are already taking root, their leaves trembling in the soft breeze. It's strange, watching something grow from both ends, roots below, leaves above, while the whole raft gently rocks with the rhythm of the lake. It feels alive. And maybe that's the secret. The Chinampa isn't just a farm, it's a living thing. It breathes water, it grows trees, it cradles crops like a floating cradle of civilization. And you're one of the weird creatures who decided to farm on a raft in the middle of a crocodile's nap zone. You fall asleep in your canoe, listening to the wind hum through the willows and the water slap gently against the edges of your floating farm. A mosquito buzzes past your ear, but decides you're not worth the trouble. Somewhere in the distance, a frog croaks the first note of what sounds like an opera. Another day down. Your raft didn't drift, your willow is still upright, and the lettuce didn't float away. Not bad for a muddy beginner. By now your hands have taken on the permanent texture of overworked adobe. Your knees creak when you crouch, your shoulders pop when you paddle, and your feet have evolved into amphibious paddles of their own, perpetually damp and immune to shame. But this morning brings something new to your Chinampa routine, the art of composting. You're introduced to the night soil canoe by a man named Tepoztecatl, who arrives with the swagger of someone who knows too much about excrement. He gestures grandly to his vessel, which is very much full of yesterday's digestive decisions, carefully collected from the public latrines of Tenochtitlan. You try not to look directly at the cargo. You fail. "Best compost in the valley," he says, beaming. "City folks eat a lot of beans." The Aztecs, you quickly learn, were champions of nutrient recycling long before it was trendy. Waste from the city wasn't wasted. It was collected, paddled across the lake, and lovingly layered into the Chinampas, feeding the soil and fueling the crops. It's gross. It's genius. It's also why the maize here grows taller than you and smells faintly of humility. Historians still debate just how organized this system was. Some argue it was state-run. Others suggest it was managed by local families or guilds of, poop paddlers. Either way, the system worked. It kept the soil rich and the city clean, and nobody had to invent synthetic fertilizer for another 600 years. After you help Tepoztecatl unload his precious cargo, trying not to breathe through your nose, Xochitl hands you a stick and a half-rotted pile of lakeweed. Time to turn the compost. You poke the heap gently, and a family of bugs scurries out like you've just ruined their brunch. You apologize, you're not sure why. Compost isn't just waste, it's strategy. Rotting plant matter, fish bones, maize husks, feathers, even old sandals, they all go into the heap, slowly breaking down into black, nutrient-rich treasure. Xochitl layers it with lake mud and lets it sit for weeks, sometimes months. The result is dark, sticky, and smells like a forest floor after rain. If the forest also hosted a chili cook-off, you help carry the finished compost to the maize rows and spread it around the base of the stalks. The difference is immediate. The plants perk up. The soil darkens. And you suddenly understand why everyone on this lake has skin that glows like polished clay and arms like braided rope. The best part? The system never ends. Compost feeds the crops, crops feed the people, people create future compost. It's a full-circle relationship that is weirdly beautiful, in a slightly gross way. Later, you help Xochitl with pest control, which she handles with a level of casual violence that surprises you. Tiny insects, caterpillars, and aphids are flicked, squished, or chased off with a brew of chili water and crushed marigolds. "Smells bad, tastes worse," she says, spraying a vine with the pungent mix. The Aztecs didn't have synthetic pesticides, but they had creativity. They used ash, chili water, and even crushed bones to protect their crops. Birds of prey were encouraged to nest in the willows to help with rodent control. Ducks were released into the canals to gobble up larvae and snails. Everything had a place, and every place had a job. And speaking of ducks, yours returns. Remember that weirdly bold waterfowl that keeps appearing around your raft? Today it hops up onto the edge of your canoe and stares you down with unsettling intensity. It's plump, slightly muddy, and, frankly, unbothered by your personal space. You name it, Minister of Agriculture. It responds by pooping near your foot. You're officially part of the lake ecosystem. In the afternoon, you help build raised nursery beds, small, reed-lined boxes floating next to the Chinampas where seedlings are coaxed into life. These delicate plants, chili, tomatoes, herbs, need protection from harsh winds and sudden downpours. You tuck them in like babies, whisper to them like Xochitl showed you, and hope the duck doesn't eat them. One seedling in particular catches your eye. A tiny, bright green sprout, curling upward like it's reaching for applause. You name it, General Bean. It has potential. As evening settles over the lake, Xochitl lights a small copal incense burner and places it at the edge of the Chinampa. She doesn't say much, just murmurs something about giving thanks to the lake. You sit beside her, eyes half closed from smoke and satisfaction, and watch the sun slip behind the distant city temples. There's something undeniably soothing about this world, a world that floats, that grows, that smells a little like chili and a little like wet socks, but works anyway. The canals reflect the twilight in ribbons of gold and violet. The willows sway like they're dancing to a music only frogs can hear. You stretch your aching arms and smile. Your Chinampa didn't sink. Your compost didn't explode. Your duck may or may not be divine. That's farming, Lake Texcoco style. You wake up to a sound that can only be described as duck-related mischief. Minister of Agriculture, as you've regretfully continued to call him, has commandeered your planting stick and is proudly parading it down the bank like a captured enemy flag. You groan, retrieve the stick, and begin your day covered in feathers and indignity. Today's task, according to Xochitl, is harvesting the mud, which sounds deceptively gentle. It is not. You paddle out toward the deeper channels near the edge of the lake, where the bottom is thick with ancient, oozy lakebed muck that's so nutrient-rich it practically glows. You've heard it described as the chocolate cake of agriculture, though the taste is, mercifully, unconfirmed. Using wide, flat baskets, you scoop it up by hand. It's heavy, it's sticky, it contains exactly one eel you were not expecting. But this is how the Chinampas stay alive. Without regular mud harvests, the gardens would slowly sink and starve. The Aztecs called it tichatl, a sacred substance, believed to be gifted by the lake gods themselves. Xochitl tells you some farmers have names for their mud, passed down through families like heirlooms. Black Moon, Featherwater, Sleeping Jaguar. Your haul, based on smell and consistency, could reasonably be called Old Socks and Regret. but you keep that to yourself. Historians still debate how often Chinampa farmers dredged the canals. Some think it was seasonal, tied to rituals and planting cycles. Others argue it was continuous, with whole families specializing in muck management. Either way, it was backbreaking work, and you now understand why Chinampa farmers were built like adobe ovens, sturdy, efficient, and always slightly steaming. Once the mud is on your raft, you mix it with lake silt, compost, and ground-up reeds, using a rake that has clearly seen better decades. The result is a rich, dark loam that smells like progress. You spread it in thick layers across your Chinampa, gently tamping it down with your bare feet. It's weirdly satisfying, like frosting a cake with your toes. Don't think too hard about that. As you work, you hear songs rising from nearby Chinampas. Not chants exactly, more like work songs, passed down across generations. They're low and rhythmic, perfectly timed to digging, spreading, planting. One voice sings a line, another answers. It's calming, like the lake itself is humming in tune. You try to join in, but your accent turns a word for corn into one for pimple, and Xochitl almost falls into the canal, laughing. Later you meet one of her uncles, a man with a face like dried fruit, and a laugh that startles birds. He teaches you how to tie the reed mats that edge the Chinampas, preventing erosion. The technique involves rapping, looping, and muttering under your breath. You do all three. The mats are made of tule reeds, harvested from the shallows and dried in the sun. They're light, flexible, and, when bundled properly, strong enough to hold back a small landslide or an ambitious duck. The uncle tells you that in the old days, before the canals were mapped and measured, farmers would sneak out at night and extend their Chinampas inch by inch with stolen mud. It was a kind of lakebed chess, with territory won by stealth and extra labor. No blood, just blisters, he says with a grin. That's how the real wars were fought. You're beginning to appreciate how layered this world is, literally. Mud, compost, crops, rituals, politics, all stacked on a floating mattress of ancient invention. It's delicate and sturdy at once, like a spiderweb or a perfectly wrapped tamale. In the afternoon, Xochitl teaches you how to mark planting rows using string and obsidian shards. The strings are stretched tight between willow poles, and you use the edge of a smooth stone or a bit of carved bone to trace furrows. It's calming work, precise, repetitive. You fall into a trance, dragging your implement through the damp earth, watching perfect rows unfold like lines on a music sheet. You're learning that the Chinampa isn't just about food, it's about balance, between earth and water, between structure and chaos, between toil and awe. The more you try to dominate the system, the less it works, but if you lean into it, if you trust the willow poles, the muck, the cycles, it begins to move with you, and yes, you still fall in sometimes. Today, it's while trying to rinse a basket and slipping off the edge with a yell that echoes all the way to the next Chinampa. You emerge, dripping, cold, and victorious. "Initiated?" Xochitl says, handing you a towel and a roasted corn cob. You munch it quietly, staring at the mountains in the distance. Somewhere beyond them, empires rise and fall. Here on the lake, the willows sway, the maize grows tall, and the mud waits patiently to be gathered again. You're sore in places you didn't know could be sore. Your legs ache from squatting, your arms from paddling, and your face from involuntary sun exposure. You're now the proud owner of a farmer's tan shaped suspiciously like a sandal strap. But today, Xochitl says, you're going to learn how the plants talk to each other. Not literally, of course, though you're not ruling that out. The corn has been looking at you funny. Today's lesson is about intercropping, an ancient science disguised as a casual suggestion to plant things together. Maize, beans, squash, Xochitl says, tapping each seed like she's introducing characters in a play. The three sisters. You kneel in the damp earth and place the maize seeds first, pushing them into the soil with your thumb. A few inches away, you plant beans, and in the corners, you nestle small squash seeds like secrets. It's not just efficient, it's symbiotic. The maize grows tall, providing a living trellis for the beans. The beans, in turn, fix nitrogen into the soil, feeding everyone. The squash sprawls across the ground, blocking weeds and keeping the soil cool. It's a living, edible hug. Historians still argue whether this precise configuration, known across Mesoamerica, was developed independently by different cultures or spread along early trade and migration routes. Either way, it's brilliant, and you're now officially part of the botanical conspiracy. You water the seeds with a scoop carved from gourd, the water still warm from the midday sun. Xochitl hands you a bundle of amaranth seeds next. Food, dye, medicine, she says, also makes you sneeze if you sniff it wrong. You take her word for it. As you plant, she explains that amaranth was once so sacred it was used in ceremonies to honor the gods, shaped into dough-like figures with honey and blood, the ceremonial kind, not the kitchen accident kind. The Spanish banned it later, worried it was fueling heretical energy. You're glad you're learning about it from someone who sees it more as a protein source and less as divine currency. In between seedings, you help prune the willow trees that form the Chinampa's structure. The willows aren't just decorative, they act like anchors, driving their roots deep into the lakebed and binding the island together. Their branches are cut and replanted, growing into living fences. You trim the young shoots and weave them into simple trellises, wiping your hands on your already doomed tunic. You're surprised to learn that the Aztecs didn't just grow food, they also cultivated flowers, and not just for aesthetics. Marigolds, morning glories, and even certain orchids served ceremonial, medicinal, and sometimes downright psychedelic purposes. You plant some of each, careful not to confuse the psychoactive ones with the snackable herbs. Xochitl shows you how to read the soil, not through lab tests, but by texture, smell, even taste, which you decline politely. Darker means richer. Crumbly is good. If it clumps too much, it needs sand. If it's too loose, more compost. You poke it, roll it between your fingers, whisper sweet encouragements. The soil doesn't respond, but you feel closer anyway. Then there's the calendar, a surprisingly advanced system of agricultural timing that blends lunar phases, solar tracking, and deeply rooted traditions. Plant maize after the 4th new moon, she says, but never on a wind day. You nod as if this makes sense. You try to keep track, but it turns out the Aztecs used multiple calendars at once, the Tonalpohualli for ritual cycles and the Xiuhpohualli for the solar year. And in between, farmers used accumulated wisdom passed down from parent to child, knowledge not written down, but etched into habits and stars. It's like planting by poem. Later in the day, you visit a nearby Chinampa, where an older couple, Xochitl's great-aunt and great-uncle, specialize in herbs and medicinal plants. Their garden smells like a dream wrapped in basil. You crouch beside a bed of epazote, inhaling the sharp aroma, while they explain how each plant serves not only a culinary purpose, but a healing one. To settle the stomach, calm the nerves, ease childbirth, repel mosquitoes, even ward off gossip, though the latter seems less scientifically tested. You help them grind chili seeds and dried herbs with a smooth river stone, turning the mixture into a powder used to deter insects and flavor soup. Your hands sting, your eyes water, you sneeze 7 times. They applaud. By now, your Chinampa looks like something out of a dreamy watercolor, rows of young maize, scattered herbs, creeping squash vines. The willow poles sway in the breeze, casting long shadows over the surface of the canal. Ducks waddle between the beds, occasionally helping themselves to a bug or two. Somewhere in the distance, a flute begins to play. You wonder if it's someone's hobby or just another form of pest control. You spend the evening sitting beside your little patch of green and chaos. Xochitl joins you with a steaming mug of cacao brew, thick, bitter, and spiced with chili. Not exactly hot chocolate, but comforting in its own right. You sip it slowly, letting the warmth settle behind your ribs. Minister of Agriculture curls up by your foot. You swear he sighs. You lean back, stare at the sky, and realize this isn't just farming, it's theater. Each plant plays a role, each season cues its entrance, and you, Sunburned, muddy, slightly over-caffeinated, you're part of the cast now. A floating actor in a performance that has run for centuries, uninterrupted. The next morning begins, as so many do now, with a duck-related incident. Minister of Agriculture has taken it upon himself to prune your squash vines. By the time you catch him, he's chewed off 3 of the healthiest leaves and is attempting to carry one off like a banner. You bribe him with a piece of maize cake and, like a minor deity appeased with offerings, he waddles off to menace a frog. Today, Xochitl tells you it's time to tend the canals themselves. You're not sure what that means at first. Aren't the canals just water? Aren't they doing fine? But no, apparently they're like moody house guests. If you ignore them too long, they stagnate, get choked with algae, and start to smell like regret and undercooked fish. You begin with clearing the aquatic weeds, especially one called tolokitl, which is both incredibly invasive and, of course, edible. It grows in thick mats that can strangle small rafts and clog paddle routes. You harvest it with a rake fashioned from bone and reed, scooping it into the canoe, where it smells like wet socks and vitamin C. Xochitl shows you how to use the weeds as fertilizer, layering them beneath the new compost piles. Nothing is wasted here, not even the gross stuff. Then it's time to dredge the silt, which requires a long pole with a flat scoop on the end, a strong back, and no fear of lake eels. You manage 2 scoops before something brushes your leg, and you invent a new Aztec word for absolutely not. Still, you get the hang of it. You start to see the water not as background scenery, but as part of the system, living, moving, breathing. Historians still argue whether the canals were a side effect of Chinampa construction or part of a deliberate irrigation network. Either way, the Aztecs mastered hydrology centuries before Europeans thought to ask, what if the water went where we wanted it to? You visit an old sluice gate nearby, hand-built from stone and timber, creaking gently with the movement of the lake. It controls water levels between Chinampa zones, allowing farmers to flood one area or drain another. It's genius, it's low-tech, and it still works after hundreds of years. Next, Xochitl shows you how to test the water quality using a technique you're not quite sure is science or superstition. You lower a piece of maize husk into the canal and watch how quickly it dissolves. Too fast means acidity, too slow stagnation. The trick, she says, is trusting your grandmother's instincts more than the water itself. You spend part of the day paddling deliveries, baskets of fresh herbs and vegetables bound for the local tianguis, or market. You're surprised to learn that Chinampa farmers weren't just growing food for themselves, they were part of an enormous economic engine. In Tenochtitlan, it's said that the market at Tlatelolco could host over 20,000 people on any given day, all bustling between stalls, exchanging everything from cacao beans to jaguar pelts. You help load your boat with fragrant bundles, epazote, chili peppers, miniature tomatoes, even a few exotic flowers. You're also entrusted with a container of axayacatl eggs, tiny, nutritious delicacies laid by aquatic insects on reeds and rocks. You carry them with extreme caution, cradling them like an anxious babysitter. Along the way, you pass other Chinampa farmers in their canoes, some old, some young, all waving and exchanging gossip over the splash of paddles. One warns you about a heron that's been stealing fish. Another boasts that his maize tassels are as tall as a warrior's lie. You nod, respectfully. Farmer trash talk is oddly poetic. In the afternoon, back on your own Chinampa, you help reinforce the canal edges with floating reed bundles weighted with stones and tied with fibre rope. It's an elegant solution to erosion and also mildly terrifying if you're not great with knots. At one point, your bundle comes undone and drifts into a neighbour's field, where a small child captures it and declares it her boat now. You do not contest her. As the sun begins to dip, the canal water turns molten gold. You and Xochitl paddle through it slowly, checking on the network of water channels like shepherds on patrol. You pass lily pads, ducks, a turtle who seems annoyed by your presence. The lake is quiet. Not silent, never silent, but peaceful, like it's humming a song only the mud understands. You help Xochitl and her cousins remap part of the Chinampa grid using old markers and strips of dyed fabric. The layout of the fields has shifted slightly with the seasons, and there's a certain dance to making sure everything still lines up with ancestral lines and water flow. One cousin insists on using a turtle shell as a measuring scoop, which seems wildly imprecise, but no one argues. Tradition is a funny thing. You end the evening by planting a few more rows of cilantro and chilies, your fingers sticky with soil, your knees protesting like grumpy elders. Minister of Agriculture falls asleep inside a basket of prickly pear pads. You almost do the same. You're starting to see it now, the rhythm of this life, the planting, the paddling, the constant, small decisions that add up to a floating ecosystem so stable and so organic, it feels more like a forest than a farm. No part of it is accidental. It's engineered, yes, but engineered with intuition, not blueprints. Each canal cleaned, each stone placed, each seed pressed into soil. It's all part of a language older than paper, but still legible if you squint your heart just right. You wake up today with a sore neck and a piece of squash vine stuck in your hair. Minister of Agriculture is standing triumphantly on your chest, having somehow brought you a gift, a very dead fish, freshly harvested from the canal. You thank him for his devotion, then quietly flick the fish into the compost pile. He seems satisfied. This morning is devoted to a subject you didn't expect, pollinators. Xochitl, ever the walking contradiction of calm and chaos, announces that the bees have returned. You're not entirely sure when they left or why, but apparently their reappearance is cause for celebration. The Aztecs didn't keep European-style beehives, but they certainly recognized the value of native stingless bees like the Melipona. They're tiny, busy, and very good at ignoring you, which makes them your favorite animals so far. You visit a neighbor's Chinampa that keeps a small grove of hollowed logs as homes for these bees. It's shaded, blooming with flowering herbs and tiny fruits, and buzzing like a polite tea party. You're handed a shard of smoked ceramic that's been dabbed with bee honey, less sweet than the European stuff, more floral, with a lingering taste of something ancient and wild. Historians still debate how widespread meliponiculture was across the Aztec Empire, whether it was a full industry or more of a household tradition. But evidence suggests the honey was used in rituals, medicine, and even tax payments. Imagine settling your imperial obligations in jars of honey. You'd take that over paperwork any day. Back at your own Chinampa, Xochitl helps you tie up some blooming squash vines to encourage more bees to stop by. You find yourself watching a hummingbird hover beside a marigold, wings invisible, a blur of ambition. The bird does not acknowledge you. You are beneath its notice. The mid-morning is spent gathering pest control supplies, which include smoked chili powder, crushed marigold leaves, and a bucket of mysterious black goo. Slug repellent, Xochitl says, not elaborating. You smear it around the base of your maize stalks, then wipe your hands on your already doomed tunic, which now smells like the underside of a campfire. You check the growing beds, some maize shoots have sprouted, and you feel a rush of parental pride. The squash is unfurling its leaves like it's stretching after a nap, and the beans are sending out tentative tendrils toward their maize neighbors like awkward middle schoolers at a dance. It's all happening slowly but steadily, and somehow without your constant interference. You paddle over to an older farmer's plot, Don Temilotzin, who has been working these waters since long before your clumsy self arrived. He's known for growing medicinal mushrooms in shaded nooks between the willows. Not the fun kind, he says, deadpan, unless your idea of fun is curing digestive ailments. You help him gather a crop of ear mushrooms, brushing off the damp soil and nestling them in reed baskets. He tells you that some varieties were used to treat fevers, others for rituals, and a few that were just delicious in soup. He also insists that one type screams when you pull it out of the ground. You decide not to check. After lunch, roasted maize cakes and a watery soup that tastes better than it looks, you help reinforce the willow fences around the Chinampa. These aren't just practical structures, they're woven like art pieces designed to keep out curious animals and the occasional wandering canoeist who thinks your plot is part of the public dock. You learn how to twist the fresh willow branches into tensioned knots, and how to tie fiber lashings using only your teeth and a terrifying amount of finger strength. By now you've started to notice that the Chinampa isn't just growing food, it's growing stories. Every section, every crop, every slightly lopsided fence post has a tale. Xochitl shows you a patch of peppers grown from seeds her great-grandmother smuggled in from a long-lost trade route, wrapped in cotton and prayers. She says that particular pepper is so hot it can chase bad dreams out of your head. You don't test that either. You spend part of the afternoon on a canoe run for clay and stones, materials used to repair the paths between plots and reinforce the edges. The lake bed is rich with soft, usable clay, and you dig it out with a scoop shaped like a turtle. Later, you'll help mold it into bricks, bowls, and a surprisingly effective bird scarer that looks like someone's impression of a very angry frog. Xochitl tells you about the mythical origins of agriculture in Mexican tradition, how the gods gifted maize to humans through acts of cunning, patience, and occasional dismemberment. Farming is divine, she says, but also the gods expect you to pull weeds. You believe her. That night, the moon is high and the Chinampa glows softly under its light. You help string floating lanterns along the canal edges, not for function, but for beauty. The tiny flames reflect on the water like a constellation fallen sideways, and you feel, just for a moment, like you're floating in the sky. A frog croaks, a breeze stirs the reeds. Minister of Agriculture snores softly under a squash leaf. You realize you've gone from outsider to participant. You know where the water flows fastest, which herbs repel mosquitoes, which frogs are noisy but harmless. You know the lake's moods, you know the people's laughter, you even know where to step without falling in. Most days anyway. This isn't just agriculture, it's culture, carefully grown. You start today, ankle deep in mud and optimism. The sun is not even up yet, but the air is already thick with the hum of insect wings and the gentle clatter of early morning paddles. Xochitl greets you with a bowl of cacao mixed with chili and maize, a breakfast drink that somehow tastes like ambition and mild regret. Today's task, she says, is something special. You're going to help build a new Chinampa, not expand, not repair, building from scratch. You thought these floating gardens just sort of appeared over time like moss or regrettable fashion trends. But no, every Chinampa begins as a feat of engineering, sweat, and an unspoken willingness to smell like lake mud for days. You begin by choosing the site. A shallow stretch of lake where the water is sluggish but not stagnant, the sun reaches most of the day, and the neighbors aren't likely to complain about construction noise, which in this case is mostly grunting and the occasional duck-related argument. You and several others start by driving wooden stakes into the lake bed. These are made from willow branches, still green and flexible. You're told they will take root and help anchor the Chinampa for generations. You try to hammer one in and it bounces off your foot twice. Xochitl doesn't say anything, but you're pretty sure she's mentally docking your pay, which is currently 0. Next comes the weaving of the reed mats, long bundles of tulle and carrizo reeds twisted into thick braids, then interlaced between the stakes to form the walls of the Chinampa to be. It's like knitting, but if the yarn is slimy, the needles weigh 20 pounds, and you're being watched by a very skeptical turtle. Once the walls are in place, you begin hauling mud, and more mud, and more mud. This is the backbreaking part, dredging up nutrient-rich sediment from the lake bottom and piling it inside the reed frame. It's messy, tedious, and strangely satisfying, like making a giant lake lasagna. You also add layers of decaying vegetation, compost, and even ashes from last night's cooking fires. The goal is to build a soft, spongy growing bed that holds moisture but doesn't flood. You pat the surface with your hands, smooth it with your forearms, then collapse dramatically like a Roman senator discovering betrayal. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs invented Chinampas themselves or refined earlier Mesoamerican practices, but one thing is clear: by the time of Tenochtitlan's peak, this system could feed hundreds of thousands. These weren't just gardens, they were the beating heart of an empire, and each new plot was a pulse. Once the base is solid, you begin planting boundary willows. These will grow into living fences, their roots helping to anchor the soil, their branches offering shade and future building material. You wrap a bit of dyed cloth around one sapling to mark it as yours. Xochitl raises an eyebrow. You named it, didn't you? You do not answer. You rest briefly under a papalotl-shaped sunshade, a fluttering fabric design meant to resemble a butterfly. A cousin of Xochitl's made it for the occasion. He insists it brings good fortune. You insist it keeps the mosquitoes out of your eyes. Win-win. Later in the day, you help create a canal break, a small barrier to divert water around the new Chinampa until the structure stabilizes. It's made of woven baskets filled with stones, shaped like smiling snakes to honor Tlaloc, the rain god. You like to think he appreciates the effort, even if he's more of a torrential flood kind of guy. With the Chinampa base complete, the planting begins. You start with easy growers: chili peppers, marigolds, and amaranth. The amaranth especially feels symbolic. It was a staple crop of the Aztecs, used in food, ceremonies, and even sculptures offered to the gods. Colonial powers once tried to ban it. It's still here. As the sun lowers, the final touches go in: a stone marker etched with today's date, a small figurine of a jaguar for protection, and a gift from Minister of Agriculture, a fish head. You bury it at the base of the first maize plant, circle of life, Chinampa style. Then comes the celebration. No drums, no grand speeches, just roasted squash, laughter, and the warm sense that something has begun. You're sore, you're covered in streaks of algae and triumph, but you helped make something living, something that might last. As you drift in your canoe back to your own Chinampa, you pass the older plots again, still producing, still vibrant, still wrapped in their ancient geometry. You see the willow roots trailing into the water like lazy tentacles. You see a woman harvesting chilies while humming to a baby strapped to her back. You see a boy trying and failing to train a duck. And you see the future, not made of machines or neon or noise, but of mud, patience, and care. Your new Chinampa won't feed an empire. It might barely feed a duck. But it's yours now, part of a mosaic stitched into the lake, whispering to the sky in green. And tomorrow it all begins again. You wake to silence, not the city kind of silence, filled with electrical humming and distant cars, but the lake's silence, which is never quite still. It pulses softly with the calls of birds, the creak of willow branches, the hush of water lapping against earthwork edges. It's the sound of a world that breathes slower than yours. Today, there's no big project. No fish trading missions or mud-hauling contests. Just maintenance, observation, and the slow art of noticing things you missed before. Xochitl hands you a bundle of corn husks tied with twine. "Today we spy," she says with mock seriousness. "These will become wind chimes and rustle strips, tools for gently deterring animals from your tender squash vines without scaring the spirits or waking the ancestors." You nod solemnly, as though you fully understand both the engineering and the metaphysics involved. You do not. You start by checking the roots of your boundary willows, brushing away excess mud to see which ones have taken. Most have, a few haven't. One is actively leaning into the canal like it's had a long night. You prop it up with a reed and whisper a motivational phrase. The tree remains unimpressed. You notice something else as you move through the rows. Color. Marigold petals like pinched sunsets, red chili pods dangling like ornaments, the deep greens of amaranth leaves, the dusty purple of young maize. The Aztecs didn't just grow food, they grew beauty, woven into form and function alike. It's said that flowers were part of tribute systems, religious offerings, and even diplomatic gestures. You can see why. Some of these blooms are more convincing than apologies. Historians still argue whether decorative planting was always intentional or whether it simply emerged from the abundance. Either way, your own Chinampa is now a small riot of colour and smell, and Minister of Agriculture seems very proud. He's built himself a throne out of broken reed baskets and 2 chili peppers. You do not disturb him. Midday brings a visitor from the market district, a woman named Malinal, who trades medicinal plants and tells you that your Chinampa's soil is unusually soft. Good for tlacopatli, she says, a soothing herb used for fevers and mosquito bites. You offer her some of your first chili harvest in exchange for a cutting. She accepts and teaches you how to whisper to the plant as you bury it. Not a spell, just good manners. You plant it beneath a crooked maize stalk. It feels like an offering. As you prune back the bean vines and restring some of your more rebellious squash, you find yourself reflecting on how much you've absorbed without noticing. The calendar cycles, for instance, how planting schedules follow the tonal pahwali, the sacred 260-day calendar that intertwines with seasonal rhythms and agricultural cues. You don't quite understand the math, but you understand the rhythm. Plant, wait, worry, celebrate, repeat. You overhear elders debating when the rains will arrive. Some consult the sky, others their knees. One insists it's all about hummingbird flight patterns. You believe all of them. They're probably all right, in different languages. By now you've learned that each Chinampa is slightly different. Some specialize in flowers for temples, others grow rare herbs for scribes and healers. One, improbably, raises turkeys, loud, extremely judgmental turkeys. You paddle past them in silence. Later in the afternoon, you help Xochitl with a ceremonial planting, maize, amaranth, and beans arranged in a spiral. It's more than practical, it's spiritual geometry, meant to invoke balance and encourage harmony between soil, water, sun, and soul. You don't ask too many questions, you just dig with reverence and try not to sneeze on the amaranth seeds. As the sun lowers toward the lake horizon, you light a candle for Tlazolteotl, the goddess of purification and renewal. Not because you've committed any major sins today, unless overwatering counts, but because it feels right. Even the Chinampa needs a moment to breathe out the day. You sit on the edge of your plot as evening mist curls across the water. The insects switch to their nighttime choir. Fireflies blink in slow Morse code. Minister of Agriculture chases something you hope isn't a snake. You reflect on everything you've done, not just today, but since the moment you arrived. The first stumbles, the failed squash transplant, the triumphant retrieval of a lost chili pepper from the canal. You've bent without breaking, you've rooted yourself. The Chinampa has taught you that stillness isn't the opposite of growth, it's part of it. And somewhere, deep in the lake bed, the willows you planted are taking hold. So now, you exhale. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Let your hands unclench, even if you didn't realize they were holding on to anything. Let your thoughts sink down, like that first layer of lake mud settling beneath the roots. You're not paddling anymore, you're drifting, and that's more than enough. The lake at night is quieter than it has any right to be. The stars don't just shine, they reflect, shimmering twice. Once above you, once below. The Chinampas are silhouettes now, dark outlines of effort and patience, softened at the edges by moonlight and mist. Somewhere a frog calls out again, less like a sound and more like punctuation to the day. The willows sway in unison, the crops breathe, the water listens. There's no harvest tonight, no checklist to finish, no weeds to pull, just rest. Your Chinampa will still be here in the morning, the amaranth will wait. The chili peppers are braver than you anyway, so lie back, if only in your mind. Imagine the cool boards of the canoe beneath your spine, the slow lap of water against your ears, the soft brush of reed leaves overhead. You are part of this now. You belong to the lake as much as the mist, as much as the maize. And as the last candle flickers out, You let your thoughts blur and quiet like ripples fading in still water. You sleep, and the garden keeps growing.